It's a very serious question. You know, when we look at the history of this country and look at what's happened now, it is not a mistake. You said it right, Isabel. It's not some serendipitous course of events. I mean, this is done on purpose, by a purpose, for a reason. You know, the introduction made me look better than what I am. I graduated from Harvard, but I also spent time in federal prison. So I've seen both sides of life in that sense. And there is an intentionality behind it. You don't build hotels unless you want occupancy. They don't build prisons and then hope people don't come. In fact, they will create laws and policies and strategies to boost that. As far as the immigrant crisis, I would be careful of how I word that. I don't think we have a crisis of immigrants. This country was built on the backs of people who came to this country and who fought and died so people like me can sit on this stage freely. So this anger that has been projected towards immigrants is not only bewildering, but it's disturbing. And so the crisis is how now certain positions and people who are in power are using power in a negative way. Now we know, and the scripture is very clear on this, if you smite the shepherd, you will scatter the sheep. It is an effort to destroy Black and Hispanic men in this country, and I don't want to talk around it. I want to speak right directly to it. And so what has happened is there is an entire generation of people who are being raised without a father, without a male affirmation in the house. And so what we are seeing is this perpetuation of cycles that are not only going to lead us down a very negative road, but in a place where, unfortunately, if we don't do something now, and that's why I think discussions like this are important, but we must do something. Something has to be done because they're fighting for what they believe, even though it's wrong. And so we have a responsibility to stand up. And I'll say this, you know, in closing, you know, we are here today because people, church mothers and deacons and pastors sat in and sat up and boycotted. Some who rode buses, wouldn't ride buses 10, 20 miles walk because they would not participate in an unfair, unjust, and unequal system. And I think it is time we speak out against it and we do something about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. You speak to audiences across the country, across the globe, and try to connect them to the experiences of incarcerated people.
Yes.
Do you think the audiences you speak to understand the impact the system is having in their own community? And do you think,
to laugh.
I know, do you think they feel empathy? And if not, how do we create more empathy in the people in those audiences?
That's a wonderful question, Deanna. So I think it depends on the audience that I'm speaking to. Maybe in some of the audiences in the inner city, yes. Maybe some of the law schools, not so much. One thing that I've tried to do is help people to understand that, you know, I think giving a face to what incarceration looks like does wonders. And when I approach people and I speak about my story, I speak about my story in the sense of not just this physical incarceration, but this aspect of my life and decisions that I'm not proud of and the transformation. And I think that's something that everybody can empathize with. All of us, no matter where we've come from, can relate to having made decisions perhaps that we're not proud of. And we can relate to transforming and wanting transformation. And so I think as we speak specifically about this issue, I think the key is to understand that sometimes our help might not come from people who look like us. I don't want to call people out, but Paul and Katie, raise your hands. They are part of the reason I'm here because Paul and Katie were instrumental in giving to Exodus. Julio Medina is the executive director there, and he was the first person to hire me when I was released from federal prison last year. So I think sometimes what happens is we have in our mind who our help is going to look like. And I find that God has a sense of humor, and he will hide something that we need and something we don't necessarily recognize at the time. And so I am grateful for people who are, and I think a lot more people, and if I could say that is the silver lining of the nastiness that has been played out on the national level now. I think people have come to grips with the fact we do have a problem. Under the Obama administration, I think we were post-racial and all this other stuff. Now people, I think, are clear that, we have a real serious issue in this country that needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed quickly. And so because of that, I think more people are coming to the table, and it is important that we not shut people out just because they may not have had our same experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Isabel, I think one of the reasons that reform is hard is that public policy and policymakers.
Yeah, but that's exactly it, Deanna. Thank you for that, because incarceration is really it's the symptom of the larger issue. And I think to talk about that issue in a vacuum is to miss everything else that's going on. By the time a young man or young woman is standing in front of a judge, it's already too late. And there are so many things that have been done before that to lead to that place, which is why we were talking about this, the fathers being taken out of the communities, because that starts it. It starts with people not even knowing who they are, a misunderstanding of identity. So wonder when we look in the schools, and by the time, they did a study that said that at 10 years old is really like the breaking period. And you see before then where, young people are, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, raising their hand and excited about what's going on. And they are excited to raise their hand if they know the answer. But around 10 and 11 is when that point comes where in many communities, in many of our communities, it's no longer cool to say you know the answer. And so it's a dimming of that light. So by the time the person is in maybe juvie or there is an arrest, in many cases, I don't want to say it's too late for there to be action, but it's already so many other things that have happened. So when we look at the education, I think is the biggest key. And I'm not just talking about education in a school. I'm talking about an understanding of who people are. And I'm talking about beyond race. This sense of, because I can't help but say this, when we begin to empower people to understand that there is greatness on the inside of you, you were made by the creator of the universe with purpose. You didn't just come through the birth canal, and you were not made by your parents. They would, and so I think when we begin to help people to understand, not in this self-aggrandizing way, but in this very concrete way, you have gifts, you have something that you can add to this world. People can begin to take pride in that. And so school becomes less about, let me learn about how every other culture is great besides mine, but it becomes now a conduit to help me to unlock the potential that's on the inside of me. So as we do that, I believe that we can begin to really help people to see in a very concrete and real way, you have worth and we need you to be who you've been designed to be. Communities are dying because people are not being who they've been called to be.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Definitely.
Just to add, well, that was well said, thank you. Just to add,
Thank you for that. Absolutely. This is a wonderful conference because people want to do something. And many of us in this room are doing something about this. And I think that that's very important, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. As far as what I would like people to take from my story, I want people to know that no matter what has happened in your life, you can be restored. And that's been the story of my life. I actually wrote Come Back Swinging. And I wrote this book partly while I was on the inside. And when I was released, I didn't know how to share the story. It's a vulnerable story. I talk about the trauma that led to some poor decisions. I talk about being introduced to sex at the age of 5 years old. I talk about the darkness in my life, even at so-called high points at law school and the things that people saw on the outside. And what I recognize is that nothing starts as a tree. It always starts as a seed. And we have a tendency to look around at the tree like, how did that happen? But it started somewhere. And my story, and this is why I wrote Come Back Swinging, and it's not a bombastic sort of like, rah-rah type thing, but it is to remind people about our voices again, that you can be restored. I've been restored by an almighty God who saw past my faults and saw my need. The same God that brought the children of Israel out of Egypt after 430 years of bondage, and that is still in the business of restoring people. And I think as we go into the workshops, I want people to think about, what are you doing right where you are with what you have to help someone? I think as we talk about changing the world, changing the nation, changing communities, that can become so grand that it's hard for us to kind of see that in our minds. But how are you helping somebody right where you are? For some people, it's a child who's looking to you and who needs you. And so I'm excited to be a part of this, again, this comeback swing. And I got to say this really quickly. I stand on the shoulders of people like Miss Alexander. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I mean that. I walked in here, I said, oh my gosh, she's here. So that picture will be on Instagram later. But really, I read your book like 3 times in law school. And so we all have a story. This is just a piece of mine. And I want you to share yours. And Come Back Swinging, I do have copies for those who are interested afterwards.
Thank you.
There's a few, but thank you for having me.
No, thank you. So I do think, and I want to echo, thank you, Michelle, because I think your book opened up to the masses of this real issue, and it crossed the color lines for individuals to read our story. And I want to add one part that I hope the participants take through this weekend is, when we're talking about these conversations, or we're having these conversations, remember centering the voices of those most impacted. Not only, I used to say we need a seat at the table, but then I started realizing that's diversity, just having a seat at the table. Because I could sit at the table and not have a voice. And I realized that at the DOJ.